Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all. Let me start and say, and just a little bit of introduction first. Thank you all for attending this webinar. Really appreciate it. My name is Professor Michael Gasiorek, and I'm co-director of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy, together with Alan Winters. I'm an international trade economist, and I also happen to be director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory at the University of Sussex. Let me say a little bit about the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy. The Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy is interdisciplinary and includes economists, lawyers, political scientists, and academics from international business. It's also composed of universities from across the UK, from each of the 4 nations of the UK, and also has the involvement of the business community, civil society, and each of the administrations in the 4 nations of the UK. The Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy is relatively new. It was established just over a year ago, and our aim is to produce the highest quality research on trade and trade policy with an explicit focus on inclusivity, notions of inclusivity, if you like, and research with public policy relevance. And this is for the UK and beyond. We are by no means just UK focused. So we don't want to just sit in our so-called ivory towers, but feel it's really important to engage with policymakers, with stakeholders, and the wider public. And if you like, this webinar, which is part of a series of webinars that we have been running, has that aim in mind. It's to present either our own research or the research of others, which addresses issues of inclusive trade and which reaches out beyond the academic community. So that's kind of the background to today's session. So enough on the CITP, and let me turn to today's session specifically and introduce our speaker. I'm really delighted to introduce Elisabeth van Lieshout, who is a trade policy analyst at the OECD, currently specializing in international services trade flows. She obtained her PhD at Stanford University, focusing on international economic cooperation in the context of free trade agreements, and has also studied at the University of Oxford and the LSE. Her research interests, however, are eclectic. So as well as working on services trade policy and on women-led firms and international trade, Elisabeth has written on the political economy of trade negotiations, investment protectionism, and also climate policies. But today, and I'm really looking forward to this, she'll be talking about her work on women-led firms in international trade, which I think is an extremely important and under-researched area. So I'm really delighted to welcome Elisabeth. Before I hand over to Elisabeth, which I'm about to do, just let me say a little bit of housekeeping. Substantive questions, analytical questions, conceptual questions, if you like, can we leave as much as possible to the end? So Elisabeth's going to talk for roughly 35-40 minutes, and then we'll open up the floor to questions, and I'll manage those questions. And so largely, let's try and leave the questions to the end. Clearly, however, if there are any clarification questions, things that are unclear during the presentation, do feel free to post the questions. So that then leads me to the next bit. Where do you post the questions? Please post all questions in the Q&A. So I will be monitoring the Q&A. So don't post them in the chat. In fact, I don't think you'll be able to see the chat. Please post the questions in the Q&A. So during the talk, if there are any clarification questions, I'll be monitoring this, and then I'll curate the discussion at the end. So on that note, let me finish off and hand over with great pleasure to Elisabeth. So Elisabeth, over to you and welcome.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that kind introduction. I really appreciate it. And I'm very happy to be here today and talk with all of you. I hope you can now see my screen. So the work I'm going to talk about today really fits so well in the theme of the Center for Inclusive Trade Policy. Thank you so much for inviting me to do this, first of all. And this work is based on a chapter that was just published this Tuesday as part of an OECD publication called the SME Economic Outlook, in which 2 co-authors and my co-authors are Jane Korinek and Annabelle Morgan, contributed a chapter called Women-Led Firms in International Trade. And that's what we'll be discussing. Let's see. So to set the stage a little bit, this overall problem of inclusive trade and how do we make sure trade works for all is a big challenge and a big priority for all of us at the time, currently. So the Center for Inclusive Trade Policy is one of the places where this discussion is happening. And at the OECD, ensuring a continued social license for trade is also one of our main priorities. Now, this overall topic is very broad. It has many aspects. So today we're going to zoom in on two dimensions in particular. The first of those is gender. There's a growing body of work showing that women seem to be benefiting less from international trade. This includes women as their role as workers, so they tend to be concentrated in sectors that are less trading and lower paid. Also, women in their role as consumers. There tends to be more protectionism on products consumed by women. And women in their role of entrepreneurs, and that's what we'll talk about here. Because the second theme I want to touch on is exporting. Now, exporting is one of many ways that people can engage with international trade, but it is one that particularly has a lot of benefits. First of all, it simply provides additional market to sell products and services to, but particularly it provides a lot of potential for the gains from scale, as well as for increases in productivity. So it's one of the most lucrative ways that businesses can engage with the outside world. So this intersection of the gender export gap is what we're going to look at. And we're going to look at this in three questions. So where I'm going to start with you is just how do women trade differently in general? And the takeaway finding here is that they export less, but there's more to this story as well. Then we'll turn to the question of why is this happening? What is holding back women from exporting and what challenges do they face? Which then leads to the follow-up of what can we do about it? What policy tools can be used to support women exporters? Because that is one of our main priorities at the OECD, is turning these findings into concrete things that governments can implement. Now, before we get into all of that, I want to give you some context about the data that I'll be using throughout the whole presentation, because this data comes from the Facebook Future of Business survey. So in collaboration with Meta, we fielded this survey on Facebook, distributing it to a random sample of businesses with Facebook pages. And we fielded this in March of 2022. And if anyone is interested in the more technical details of survey methodology and fielding, I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But the sample we ended up with after all of that is around 10,000 businesses. And we chose here specifically to focus only on OECD countries because of the purposes of our publication, and only on SMEs, which we're defining here as businesses with fewer than 250 employees. Now, the really important part that's going to come up again and again is this definition of what types of firms are women-led versus men-led. You'll hear me say that many times. And the way we're defining or measuring that here is we ask businesses what best describes the owners and managers of this business. And their options were either mostly men, mostly women, or about equal. In a sample, we ended up having about 40% men-led firms, 31% women-led firms, and then 29% that expressed about equal. So we really have a good spread between these and can really talk about each of these groups. So let's start doing that. Let's look at the question of how do women entrepreneurs trade differently? And the takeaway finding I have for you here, and the one thing I'm going to hope you remember from this talk, is that women-led firms export substantially less than those led by men. 11% of women-led firms in our sample compared to 16% of men-led firms. And that 5 percentage point difference, given the general rarity of exporting in the first place, is really very noticeable. Now, a logical follow-up question you might have is, what's happening here? Why is this happening? And so to unpack that a little bit, we used a method called the Kitagawa decomposition, which is a technique most commonly used to analyze the gender wage gap, because it lets you break down where the differences between two groups are coming from. So it's really quite suitable for the question we have here. And what we found is that about 26% of this difference is because of the sectors in which these firms are located. Women tend to lead firms more in services sectors, which tend to export less. There's also 27% of the difference due to business size. Women-led firms are overall smaller, and smaller firms are also less likely to export. Then there's about 12% coming just from variation in countries, where some of the countries in our sample both have more women leaders and more exports, or vice versa. About 1% not listed here due to the age of the business. So as a business exists longer, it is more likely to export. But crucially, there's a 34% remaining that is unexplained. When we looked at all the characteristics of businesses that we could observe in this survey, that did not do anything to kind of make this gap go away or explain it. And this is a part we can really think of as a pure gender difference that's not due to firm characteristics and that really merits some further exploration and explanation. Now, let's break this gender export gap down a little bit to give you a sense of what it looks like in different contexts. So when looking at this graph, the dark squares are the businesses led by women, and the slightly lighter circles are those led by men. And on the x-axis, we have the share of firms that are engaging in exports, meaning that the lines show you the gap between men and women-led firms. So on the left side, we're looking at the size of the business. Now, first of all, as we would expect, larger businesses on the whole export more. But we also see that the gender gap seems to increase with size and exists at almost every size. So it is not purely a factor of size, although that does play an important role. On the right-hand side, we have industry. And here we see the type of variation between industries that we would naturally expect when thinking about trade, with a lot less trade on the types of in-person services at the bottom and more trade in things like manufacturing or agriculture. But we see still that there's export gaps in almost every industry. And interestingly, some of the industries where we don't see one, for example, agriculture and construction, are ones where women leaders are exceedingly rare. So these might be more consequences of very small samples in those groups. Now, you might think if women overall export less, then the women that are exporting are also going to export lower quantities or to fewer places. But to our surprise, that's not at all what we found. We found that the export behavior conditional on engaging in exports is really very similar. So in the first graph on the top, we show the share of sales from exports. So the share of overall sales that a company is doing. And there's not really a systematic difference here between the male and female-led firms. Similarly, on the bottom, we look at the number of export destinations, so unique countries that a firm is exporting to. And there again, there's kind of broadly a similarity between male and female-led firms. So tentatively, I would interpret this as suggesting it's really the initial obstacles to starting with exporting that are most difficult for women-led firms. Now, I told you our focus today here is on exporting, but I want to briefly highlight some other gender differences in the realm of trade that I just think are interesting and of interest to you. And the first of those is importing. We also asked firms whether or not they import, and we see women-led firms are less likely to do so. Here, the difference is 11% for women and 15% for men. The main explanatory factor there is sector, but still a 3% percentage point difference remains even when we control for that and other factors. So again, there seems to be a meaningful gender difference on the import side as well. Another aspect here is supply chains. So since we fielded this survey in spring of 2022, we were really keen to include something about how the pandemic and all the supply chain consequences that it brought with it affected different firms. And we found men-led firms are across the board more likely to be affected on almost every measure that we offered them, which stands to reason. If you will both import and export more, there's far more ways that supply chain shocks can end up impacting you. Interestingly, the most named concern by far was higher shipping costs, but then also delays both in receiving supplies and delivering supplies to customers. Now, lastly, the topic of digital trade, which is of growing importance. We ran a very similar survey in 2019, and when we compared answers between 2019 and 2022, we saw that women-led firms substantially increased their use of online sales in a way that men-led firms really didn't. Women-led firms in the 2022 survey were also more likely to say they use digital tools for things like communicating with their customers or advertising their products and services. But we asked separately about exporting online, and there the gender gap was about the same as the overall gender export gap that we found. So we think there's an opportunity here really to leverage the strength that women-led businesses have overall in exporting and selling digitally deliverables, goods and services as a form of exports. So let's circle back to exports. What is it that's holding back these women-led firms? Now, we have a little bit of a framework here of thinking about what are the types or categories of obstacles that women face. And the first is the characteristics of the businesses that they lead. And we already touched on this earlier. Women are most likely to work in services across the board in most OECD societies. And so they also are more likely to lead businesses in these sectors, as that is where they gain their experiences and move upward. Now, services are much less likely to be exported. A lot of them are in person, a lot of them require presence, and so it's more difficult to do so. Often there's more transaction costs involved, or there's higher barriers to trade. And so any firm in a services sector is going to be less likely to export. Women-led firms also tend to be smaller. And this can be, for example, because women have less time available to invest in their business, especially in micro and small enterprises, or because of financing obstacles that we'll talk about in a second. And small firms across the board also are less likely to export. Exporting, especially starting to export, entails quite considerable fixed costs that firms have to bear at the beginning to create the types of relationships, invest in physical infrastructure, invest in know-how. And a small firm will find it harder to put down that upfront investment to get their exporting going. Now, a second bundle of challenges relate to things that generally are hard for women entrepreneurs and that also hold them back in their domestic operations, but that end up having follow-on consequences when it comes to trading. So we know both from our survey and from pre-existing work that women have less access to financing. Their loans to banks are more likely to be rejected, and they're more likely to rely on alternative financing, things like family and friends or crowdsourcing, which tend to raise much lower amounts. Now, financing is also crucial when it comes to trade. All those investments I just mentioned are costly. And even running a trading business often requires a little bit more upfront putting money down. And so less access to funding really is an obstacle when it comes to exporting. Women also tend to have much shallower business networks, kind of ideas about old boy networks and the importance of networking in business really tend to disadvantage women. And trading requires even more expansive networks. Now you need a network, not just in your own city or your own country, but also elsewhere abroad to be able to set up all of these trading ties. So if your networks are shallow to begin with in trade, that is particularly going to pose a problem. Third, we have some challenges really specific to trade. Trading is quite a technical matter, especially for SMEs. There's a lot of know-how involved. You require to have information about the foreign markets to get a sense where my good or service be in demand and kind of when is it going to be profitable for me to sell it there. But there's also a fair amount of regulation, anything from customs to the regulation of the foreign country. All of that requires an information that firms have to acquire. And this is all more difficult for women-led firms. And how do we know this? This is where we have some specific data in the survey. So for the firms that already export, we asked them what challenges they face when doing so. Now, a first thing to notice here is that across the board, the most common answer was finding business partners. And this really highlights, again, the importance of networks when it goes when trying to trade. But then three of the other really commonly named factors, understanding foreign markets, navigating foreign regulations, and custom regulations at home, which all relate to the availability of information, are all more likely to be named by women-led firms in the survey. And so providing these women with the type of information and knowledge they need would be one of the ways to tackle kind of their obstacles to trading. We also asked to those firms that don't yet export, have you considered it? Have you thought about it? We see, first of all, here that men across the board or men-led firms are more likely to say, yes, we've given this thought, but there's something holding us back. Another really notable thing to me is that the most common answer by far is no, our product is not suitable for export. And we see this happening particularly in services sectors where it's understandable to feel that exports is not really available. Now, with the increasing tradability of services, for example, online, but also in other ways, there's a lot of potential for this to shift and for a lot of these women-led firms in this bundle to actually start being able to export, but perhaps needing the support in doing so. Lastly, I want to highlight on the very last column, we have here that women are more likely, again, to say they lack the necessary skills. This is still a relatively small number, but it reinforces this idea of information as a really important barrier. Which turns us to our third question. What are the policy tools that can be used to support women in exporting? How can we make this more possible for them to address this export gap and kind of give them access to all the advantages that exporting entails? And in our chapter, we will highlight a really broad range of policies, and we go into all of these in more details. But I want to bundle them a little bit. The first set we can think about is your very classic trade policies, the creating of trade agreements and the market access you grant in them. When it comes to market access, ensuring that the types of products that women would like to export, such as services, have access into foreign markets would be really valuable, as well as access potentially for the products they would like to import, such as the inputs to their products and services. In trade agreements more broadly, there's a lot of other things that can be done as well. A lot of contemporary trade agreements have begun including either simple clauses or whole chapters around gender that go into a lot more detail about the effect of women and the things that can be done to support them. Moving a little bit beyond that, there's the realm of trade facilitation and trade promotion. These are broadly pursued by a lot of countries and are broadly beneficial for all SMEs. But as we just saw in the previous slides, access to information and the kind of facilitating and lowering of barriers and smoothing of the process is particularly helpful for women, because this is one of the main concerns that women-led businesses express. And so designing trade facilitation and trade promotion programs with those concerns in mind and targeting women and their firms specifically could be one of the most kind of accessible and high impact ways to address the gender export gap. Then there are policies that are probably attractive for governments across the board in supporting their SMEs, which is often already a government priority in most areas. So providing better financing for small and medium enterprises, enabling the creation of professional networks, things like hubs for startups and outreach events to make laying these links much more possible. And then improving digital access with the increasing digitization of the economy. Things like fast internet access, but also digital skills are incredibly valuable across the board, but can again be specifically useful for women and for exporting. Lastly, something that we always try to highlight is the need for really good data. Part of the reason we rely here on a survey rather than something a bit more comprehensive that doesn't rely on Facebook specifically is that there's just not that much gender disaggregated trade data available. This is not collected by most governments. It's quite challenging to collect, in all fairness. But it really holds back what we can do analytically. And as Michael highlighted, this is a relatively under-researched topic, in large part for this reason. And so more efforts to collect this data, either in government context or privately or elsewhere, would be a major benefit. Now, this is all still a little bit abstract. So I want to walk through just a few examples of specific policies that we've seen implemented in OECD countries that we work with to give you a bit more of a feel of what a mix of these actions could look like in practice. So in Ireland, they've adopted something called an action plan for women in business, which sets out a number of really specific and quite ambitious targets on how to improve the presence of women entrepreneurs across the board. And one of those targets is doubling the number of women-led firms in international trade. And importantly, part of the plan includes gathering the data needed to be able to track their progress on all of these goals. Now, among other things, one of the really interesting things they've done here is introduce ring-fenced funding for women entrepreneurs. And this is funding in lower amounts and with fewer requirements. And it also comes with relevant training for founders. And with that, it really enables kind of very small firms to start the scale-up process that is needed to then be able to engage in trading. In Turkey, there's, New Zealand. That's the next slide. In New Zealand, we conducted a study at the OECD called the OECD Trade and Gender Review. And this is the first review of its kind, but we're pursuing doing more of those. So if you're interested in much more of a deep dive on trade and gender in a particular country context, this could be a publication of interest to you. So the implementation of this kind of policy plan that we designed has already begun. Among other things, the Trade Promotion Agency is doing a lot of things such as organizing women in export leadership events, increasing the participation of women in trade missions, and ensuring that female-led businesses get matched with advisors in their export agency to try to create that broad range of support. They also concluded 2 trade agreements in 2022, one of them with the UK and the other with the EU, that include these really expansive gender chapters that go quite far beyond what's been done in the past to really try to push this agenda. So then we get to Turkey, as I previewed. There's a Women and Young Entrepreneurs Export Department that are pursuing a lot of interesting things. One of those is a Women Entrepreneurs Network program that provides training and mentoring and networking to over 3,000 women to date. They also created an online business-to-business platform that allows firms to kind of find each other. And they partnered with logistics firm UPS to create something called the Turkish Export Academy, which provide information specifically about e-commerce and digital marketing and other digital skills. So with that, I'm going to wrap us up, and I have a few more things to say. So the takeaway message that I'm hoping you all go home with is that women entrepreneurs do export less. And this is a problem we should care about, a problem we should be aware of. But we also are increasingly getting a good sense of what the obstacles are and what policies can be used to target those problems and address them. Now, I also want to highlight that this work is part of a much broader body of work that we're doing at the OECD about inclusive trade. So we have other work on trade and gender beyond this, looking at different aspects of how women engage in international markets. We are just starting work now on trade and indigenous people. That's promising to be really interesting. We have both past work streams and a really big bundle of work we're currently starting out with on trade and workers and how the labor market is affected. And then we have longstanding ongoing work on trade and the environment. And so if anyone is interested in these other themes of inclusive trades, feel free to reach out to me kind of offline outside the context of this webinar, and I can either talk to you about it or put you in touch with our relevant experts on it. So here at the top is my personal email, and across the screen you see some other ways of engaging with the OECD on our trade work. So that's what I got for now. I'm really looking forward to your questions and to our discussion.
Fantastic, Elisabeth. That was admirably clear and admirably timed. So thank you. And really, really interesting. Let me kick off with a couple of questions and maybe a comment, as it were, and then I'll open it up to the floor. My questions are, it's not really a clarification question, but I'm just interested in, you've got this difference in the shares of women-led firms in exports in comparison to male-led firms or men-led firms. How does that compare to the overall population of women-led businesses versus male-led businesses? How much difference is there in the structure of those that trade versus those that produce? Is sort of one of my sort of questions. Second question was, in terms of the business characteristics, maybe you don't have this data. I was wondering if you had information on not just who leads the firms, but ownership, in particular foreign ownership, and whether there's a difference between female-led and men-led firms in terms of foreign or non-foreign ownership. And then my comment is, when you did your decomposition, you said, look, part of this difference between female-led firms and male-led firms is due to the sector they're in and the size they're in. And what we're left with, if I remember correctly, was something like 25 or 26% is therefore down to, we think this is down to some form of gender, difference, as it were. But presumably, the sector that females work in is also, sorry, let me put this differently. Presumably, both size and sector is partly endogenous. So it may be that female firms choose or end up working in particular sectors because they are female. And that isn't entirely captured by that decomposition. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks for those. Those are really good questions to start us off with. I think your comment and your first question really go together of kind of how do we end up with having women being located in different places to begin with. There's absolutely some endogeneity of women are in certain sectors, therefore they keep working in those sectors, therefore they lead firms in those sectors, and that kind of reinforces itself over time. I think it is pretty hard there to untangle kind of the chicken and egg problem of, are these firms not exporting because they're led by women? Are these firms led by women because they're not exporting? It obviously goes together. To some extent, no matter which it is, I think this is kind of worthy of our attention and worthy of policy action, given kind of the implications of exporting that we've discussed. But to me, what our decomposition does show is that even if we control for, in a kind of econometric way, the size and the sector and all these other things we know, the difference remains. So it's not just the case that women are located in services and services aren't really exported, and that's kind of end of story. That doesn't do all that we need it to do. Now, on the point of the overall population, I'm need to remember the number now, but I think it was 40% of our firms are men-led and 31% are women-led in the sample. So it's certainly not the case that it's just exceedingly rare for women to lead firms, and therefore that's kind of causing the problem. All of the calculations you saw are also kind of the percent of firms in a category. So the fact that there's fewer women-led firms is not kind of a major driver in these results. I do think there's an interesting conversation to be had about if we generally encourage female entrepreneurship and women lead more firms, will that or won't that address this issue? Or kind of known issues around glass ceilings of, do women end up not rising up in leadership in particularly successful businesses? And is that what's going on here? I think those are all possibilities, but they require kind of more granular analysis, more at the individual woman level rather than the firm level. So it's not something we're touching on here, but I would love to work on in the future. Then your question about ownership, which is well taken. So we do ask separately in the survey about the gender of ownership. It's not our preferred analysis question, but we rather use the management one, both because management is more important in day-to-day operations, and because in ownership, we give the option of this firm is not owned by people, but by, other businesses, or it's publicly owned, et cetera. But we have rerun these analyses looking at that question, and the patterns are really very similar. The overall kind of story pans out the same way. I like your question, though, about foreign ownership. That is not something we've looked at all. My guess is that with SMEs for under 250 employees, it's relatively rare. We're not talking about multinational enterprises here, but it's also not unheard of. So this is something we could think about in the future, what effect that might have.
Great, thanks very much. Let me turn to the sort of questions that are in the Q&A. First question from Alan Winters. You classify the firms by current management. Have you anything on women-founded firms, share of genders over the last 10 years or so?
I mean, that's a great question. The short answer is no, we don't know. We're pretty limited on this survey in the number of questions we could ask. Meta was understandably kind of putting on the brakes when we first came with our full list of everything we would like to know. So all we have is these management and ownership questions that I've described to you. I would love to know more about these pathways and this kind of dynamics in the future, but we'd need a very different data set to do it.
Just picking up on the dynamics and stuff, you've only got a single survey from 2022, is that correct?
No. So the main survey we're using here is that one. We ran a really similar one in 2019 that had a lot of the same questions. We use it here only in this comparison of the kind of overtime adoption of digital technology. When looking at all these other analyses I've shown you, the results are just very similar in 2019. So we could have bundled it and had more data that kind of would have been nice for some purposes, but given everything that happened between 2019 and 2022, we felt a little bit uncomfortable doing that, and so opted for just the newer sample. The overall Future in Business survey had also already been running for a few years before that. It just hadn't included these export questions, so that we can't use, unfortunately.
Yeah. So leaving aside the non-trivial minor question about what happened between 2019 and 2022, what would be nice to see is, in particular, when you go on to the last part of your presentation about policy recommendations, whether there's any relationship between policies introduced and changes in female participation in entrepreneurship and trade and so on. But I guess, as you say, it's quite a difficult time period to assess that over. So I'm hoping that there will be future versions of this survey.
It is a difficult time period. There's an additional problem that, while 10,000 observations is a lot for doing what we're doing, in a lot of the countries we're looking at, we have maybe 500 in that country. That's a little bit small to say whether, a very targeted mentorship program by the government is doing something or not, because very likely none of those 500 firms are going to have been in that program. So what I personally would love to see is for the governments pursuing these policies to really do impact assessments at the level of their own policy. I think that would be incredibly informative. I just don't know if those programs are ongoing and what they're going to end up looking like if they are.
Let me turn to the next question, which comes from Ginny Rose. So this is a technical question about the definition of women-led business. We have conducted surveys which asks, are you women-led? But also about the proportion of working directors and partners which are women. We have found that there is a low match-up between countries with greater than 50% working owners and partners who are women and those who self-identify as women-led? Have you come across this problem, and which definition do you prefer to use? So it's meant to be a low match-up between companies with greater than 50%. Not there's a qualification there from Ginny in the subsequent comment.
So if I understand correctly, the idea is that you find that companies that have women owners don't necessarily say that they do, and vice versa. That's interesting. We have not been too worried about people telling the truth on this question, but your comment makes me think that perhaps we should have been. Because we can't really follow up with these companies directly, there's no way for us to really check whether them saying they're women-led is true or whether they're kind of thinking about this in the wrong way. We hoped by giving them this about equal option in the middle, those where it was kind of, touch and go would just funnel into that answer option, and we could get the kind of cleaner women and men-led categories. We also phrased it purposely quite vaguely of what describes the owners and managers of this business, so that depending on the business, they could interpret that quite differently. I think there our concern was we have everything from kind of, a little mom and pop shop with 3 people to, in the whole sample, really large businesses, but even here, companies of 200 people, and there, a management team can easily be 10 people. But I think it's a fair question. It could be a problem for us. Perhaps if we have the opportunity in the future to survey businesses where we can also kind of go and head count ourselves, this would be a good check to do, but we haven't done that.
Thank you. And then a question from an anonymous attendee. You suggested that one policy action to address the gender export gap would be to negotiate TPAs, which I assume these are trade policy agreements, that support specific sectors where women make up a large share of the workforce. Do you know of any countries that have done this in the past?
That's a fun question. I know that a lot of our delegations at the OECD of governments are really concerned with this question of kind of women in trade. And so, they're talking to us about the research. We've given them this recommendation of, hey, don't just think about gender when you write your little gender chapter, also think about it in every other chapter of the agreement. They're very well aware of this, of course. So I imagine that when they then sit down and write both the market access, that they're willing to offer and the market access that they're requesting from their partner, that they're also taking this into account and putting this as part of their analysis. That said, governments are not that open about that part of the process. It's the kind of, corporate secret part of a trade negotiation. So I can't say specifically like, hey, the inclusion of this services sector in this agreement, that was for the women. I'm hoping that it's out there, but I think it's a little bit tricky, especially when you get to, product level tariffs and your 6-digit HS codes and it gets really specific. It's hard to say, but tentatively my answer is I think so, but I cannot promise it.
And do you have any thoughts, feelings, sense of how meaningful stroke effective these sort of gender chapters in free trade agreements, like let's say between New Zealand and the UK, really are? Because there is a narrative out there that says these are just best endeavour clauses, there's nothing binding in there, they're not part of dispute settlement, so they're there because they sound good and they sound like we're being progressive, but in fact they don't have much in. I think it's an understandable skepticism. My first instinct is anything is better than nothing. I also think to a large extent how effective these are depends on the intention behind it from the countries. So to my knowledge, with the UK-New Zealand agreement, for example, both countries are really prioritizing women in their trade policy right now. They're pursuing a lot of other actions around this. So I would read that as in good faith that they included in this agreement. They're going to pursue what is in there. Because often these are, as you said, not legally binding things, but intentions like we're going to organize these events, or we're going to do these consultations, or we're going to check in with each other about this in a couple of years. And these are all things that are available for countries to do. They're also not that costly for countries to do, right? This is not the like, oh, I'm giving you a market access I really didn't want to give you. Like, this is something they want to be doing in the first place. And so having an avenue and a forum and institutionalization to be able to do that is really very valuable. Okay, thank you. Next question from Mattia Diobaldo. Trade possibly requires different job patterns compared to production for the domestic market. To what extent do societal constraints, e.g. less flexible work times, more childcare duties, feeds into the outcomes you observe in terms of participation to trade? And let me add that, and do you have data on this?
That's a really great question. I think that's really interesting to think about. I think to start with whether trade requires a different way of working is going to be pretty dependent on the industry. I mean, if you're doing the kind of physical shipping of a bunch of goods and now someone has to go to the harbor and oversee that, and so they're not going to make childcare pickup, then, there's a lot of implications. But if it's just a matter of more work needs to be done and you can hire more people to cover it, it doesn't necessarily have to have those implications. But let's say that it does. Let's say you need to hop on a call at an inconvenient time because of time zones, and so there's less flexibility. I think it could really be a big factor. I would imagine you might be able to see that in countries with better provisions around this, or in families with better provisions around this, this becomes less of a constraint. It's really not something we can observe here. You won't be surprised to hear. I think in data sets at the individual level, say labor force surveys or panel household surveys, it might become a bit more possible to look at, hey, do these people have children? Do they live in a locality where childcare is available? Or does this person have a contract with flexible working hours or not? And then start digging into this a little bit more deeply. It'd still be a pretty challenging analysis to pull off, given the very many factors involved. I think also getting a better sense of what actually is extra required when you're trading. Does it actually have less flexibility? Does it have many more hours? I would love some more details on that. I don't think I know of any work that has looked at that level of granularity. That's all a way of saying, I think that's really interesting. I haven't thought about it or looked at it empirically yet, but I think it would be doable with some careful attention. And I'm definitely writing this down as something to pursue.
Yeah, I guess many of those things that Mattia mentions also apply generally to female participation in entrepreneurship and not just in trade. There may well be a trade angle, but I think they probably are broader. But then Absolutely. I assume also by your answer that when you did a more in-depth case study of New Zealand, it wasn't possible to also think about or unpick some of these issues.
I'm thinking back now of everything that's covered in that study. I don't think we looked at that there. There was some firm level data, so we can look at specifically which businesses are exporting. And that's a really big plus, because a lot of the times it's really not sectors, but individual businesses where the variation lies in exporting or not. But for this, I think we need to go down to the level of individuals. And I don't think we were able to do that there.
Okay. Another question from Alan Winters. On policies, most of what you said seemed to apply to both men and women. How often and of what form are gender discriminating policies?
Yeah, none of this, or pretty much none of it, is explicitly gender discriminating, right? Like the obstacles to trading, such as getting information, is hard, or the obstacles to being an entrepreneur, such as getting a bank loan when you're a small business, is hard. That absolutely applies to everyone. All the gender discrimination here, as far as I can tell, is purely de facto, where we see that women-led businesses get their loans turned down, even though they look observably similar to men-led firms. Or, in practice, childcare obligations are more important for women, even though that doesn't need to be the case. And so I think gender discrimination is maybe not the right way to think about it. Because no one is really actively discriminating here, at least when it comes to kind of the point of trading. But it's more that some things are systematically more difficult. As you said, Michael, for women entrepreneurs in general, for women workers in general. But when it comes to trading, because it's relatively difficult, because it's relatively costly, because there's a lot of information constraints, all of that gets kind of sharpened a little bit. It becomes even more binding, becomes even more sharp. Even if it's already happening across the board and holding back women in a lot of other areas of life. But the positive take here is, you're right, most of these policies apply for both men and women. Any of these programs that governments could pursue, particularly things around trade facilitation and promotion, or increased financing, increased information, that's all great for all SMEs. So insofar as the encouragement of SMEs in trading is a policy priority to begin with, it's a win-win situation. So that's my positive take on it.
Good. Another question from anonymous attendee. is there a country that you would consider best evaluates the distributional impacts of trade in their trade policy and preferential trade agreements? If so, how does this country compare to the UK?
You're making it.
You're really being put on the line here.
Yeah, I do have to go, face all OECD members in our regular meetings with them. So I'm a little bit hesitant to kind of name names too much. I think in terms of evaluation, the most extensive evaluation I know of is our New Zealand review that we really did in collaboration with them. It was very much a joint publication. So if you want to see what this really detailed impact evaluation looks like, that would be what I would point to.
But I'm going to interrupt you here, but how many other countries have even done a gender trade impact assessment?
So there's some other countries that have done them kind of on their own steam. Off the top of my head, the one I remember is Canada, but I know there are others. And for this, I would point you to our chapter where, I gave you 3 country examples, but I think we have about 6 of them or so in the chapter. So you can get a little bit more of a rich view of what different countries have done and what they have prioritized, because there's so much, you got to kind of pick and choose what you move on first. In terms of your question about how does it compare to the UK, obviously the UK in recent years has had to kind of reinvent its trade policy and what it looks like. And from my kind of interactions with UK government officials, it seems they're really prioritizing gender as part of this. They're trying to be really comprehensive and bottom up as they're kind of have this opportunity to rethink things. So my sense is in that sense very positive. I can't immediately name you details about this has been done, this has not been done, this is what I think should be done, or anything along those lines. But certainly it's being talked and thought about.
Thank you. I had another couple of questions, and this goes back to, in some sense, your raw data and the characteristics of firms, which I'm finding really interesting to try and think through. One of the things that I wonder about is if female-led firms are generally younger. This is a newer development, and that's why they're smaller. It's not that they're inherently smaller, but it takes time to build up a business. Mm-hmm. So I was wondering if you had any information on sort of the age of firms and also the duration mm-hmm. of firms, how long they last and whether or not they go out of business and so on. It's about the sort of those dynamics I'm interested in.
Yeah, I'm very interested in that as well. So we do ask, when was the business founded? And so with that, we can kind of infer how long has the business been around. And so in all of these analyses, we're kind of double checking, hey, if we control for business characteristics, do our results still hold? And age is always included there as one of our kind of standard battery of control variables. Age ends up not doing as much as you would think. I think I had the same instinct as you that would matter a lot. And mostly it does not. You are right, though, that women-led firms are younger. What I don't know, so it could be what you kind of seem to postulate, that more recently women have felt more empowered to become entrepreneurs, and so it's a newer phenomenon. My more pessimistic interpretation is that women-led businesses kind of die more. Most SMEs don't make it for very long. Yeah. It's very common for them to go out of business. And if you have more difficulty accessing financing, which is often kind of the number one constraint, then the chances you go under are much larger. So I'm more pessimistically would guess that what's happening is women-led businesses just die off more. And so there's fewer that make it to an older age.
Yeah, so what would be really interesting would be to try and do some analysis on the characteristics of firms that drop out of exporting or drop out entirely.
Yeah, I would love to do that. We do not have a panel. So I told you there's repeated waves of this survey, but it's repeated cross sections. Sure. We're never interviewing the same firm twice. In fact, it's excluded that a firm could participate twice. So we need a very different type of data set that follows firms over time. This goes back to what I've said before, the need for more data. If anyone had a good firm level data set that has all the information about all the gender, ideally of everyone who works there, but at least of all the management, you could get at that, but it'd be quite an undertaking.
I think it'd be a very big undertaking to do this in a sort of cross-country sense, but there are now plenty of detailed firm level data sets for individual countries. Mm-hmm. So for individual countries, I could envisage that kind of analysis could be undertaken.
I could envision it as well, yes. Even a lot of the firm level data sets don't end up being really good, complete panels, having like a really long time progression. Because ideally, if I was doing this, I would want at least a decade or so to have something to work with.
Yeah.
That is still quite challenging. But you're right, it does exist for some countries. I'm hoping some researchers are out there working on this. I'm not, unfortunately, but I wish I was.
And then the other data-related question I had for you, or sort of factual question, is you mentioned several times that women-led firms tend to be more focused in services, but then you're sort of grouping services very loosely.
Yes.
Is there any pattern to which services they're focused in? And does that go some way to explaining one of the statistics in the paper and in the chapter, which is that women-led firms also tend to sell much more to final consumers than intermediate products, which I thought was really interesting, and that really wasn't obvious to me.
Oh, that's a bunch of interesting questions there. So on the last point, yes, you're right. Women are more likely to sell to consumers than to other businesses, which we think is interesting. I think you're right. That could be due to a sector breakdown. I haven't empirically looked at how much of that difference is explained by it, but I'm going to write that down as a kind of good double check to do. But on your question about services as a whole, so we do in the data have these more detailed industry categories. And when we're kind of controlling for sector in our analysis, we're doing it at that detailed level. In terms of where women work, yes, it's more the types of in-person care, or so things like care, education, retail or face-to-face services, the hairdressers, things like that. That's a really, really large part of it. The types of services that we think of as being much more tradable, things like lawyers, consultants, architects, kind of that idea, women are less represented there. Still more so than in something like agriculture or manufacturing, which is your very classic trade sectors. So there's really this pretty clear inverse relationship between how tradable is a sector and how many women work there. I mean, for other work, we've kind of plotted this against each other, and you get a pretty beautiful line to an extent that's kind of fascinating in and of its own right, kind of what is going on there. How did we end up in that situation? I don't have a good answer for it. But yeah, there's absolutely variation even within services that deserves to be teased out further.
Very interesting. I mean, I really hope the OECD continues this work and that there is much more done on this, because I think this is absolutely fascinating and really, really important. Okay, well, in that case, Elisabeth, can I thank you hugely? A big congratulations. Fantastic work. Really, really interesting. And hopefully we can follow up on this in a year's time, the next survey.
That would be great. We've got a lot in the works, so it'd be great to talk to you again.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you very, very much. Okay, goodbye, everybody.
Bye.